Okay, so the ovarian cycle or the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle, right? They typically mean the same thing. Well, just to get into more specifics, you have this entire process we're calling is the menstrual cycle, right? During the menstrual cycle, there's changes in essentially two major places that we're going to focus on. A, the woman's ovaries, right over here. Some books will call this the ovarian cycle if it focuses primarily on the woman's ovaries. Or B, the uterine lining, also known as the uterine cycles, right? So notice in this diagram we are focusing below here is the uterus and up here is the ovaries. Now the menstrual cycle is divided up into 28 days. I'm going to draw a little circle right here, right? We have day 1, day 14. I'm going to do day 1/28. Right. So these days may be slightly off. Remember, not every day, it's not exactly 14 days for certain people. Right. At day 14, you have ovulation. That egg gets released. So let's say this is the egg. That egg or the ovum gets released from this ovarian follicle. We're going to talk about what this ovarian follicle is in a little bit. Right? Day 14, we have something called ovulation. Right? Now, if you look at this carefully, right, if the woman is at the beginning of her menstrual cycle, right over here, is she able to get pregnant if she had unprotected sex with the guy? And the answer is no. But that doesn't mean anyone should be reckless. You should still use precaution, right? Now, from day 1 through day 14, we have a phase of the menstrual cycle. We're going to call this phase, since it is before ovulation, it is called the pre-ovulatory phase. It is also called the follicular phase. Why do you think it's called the follicular phase? Because there is a hormone that acts primarily on the follicular phase called follicle stimulating hormone. Also known as FSH. Right? And it's going to stimulate the ovarian follicle. We're going to talk about what this ovarian follicle is in a second. From day 14 through day 28, aka day 1, we are going to call this phase here the post-ovulatory phase. There's another name for this phase I do want you to know. That's called the luteal phase. Why do you think it's called the luteal phase? Because there's a hormone called luteinizing hormone that acts primarily on this phase, also known as LH. Remember, FSH and LH are produced by the anterior pituitary. They're tropic hormones. They're going to get released They're going to bind onto this ovarian follicle cell, right? And then the cycle, since it's a cycle, it is going to restart again. Now we're going to talk about some basics. If you look at an ovary right over here, right, we're going to do this again. Every month there is a chosen one, right? What do I mean by chosen one? There's a woman has many of these ovarian follicles right here, right? It looks like this one got chosen, right? So this is the ovarian follicle that got chosen. The definition of an ovarian follicle is that it contains follicular cells or follicle cells, and it contains the egg, also known as the ovum. So let's look over here. This is the egg cell, and these are the follicular cells, right? We call this whole thing an ovarian, we call this whole thing an ovarian follicle, right? And what happens here is that these follicular cells that I have drawn for you over here, right, they're going to bind onto a hormone that is going to stimulate these follicular cells called follicle stimulating hormone. And they're going to cause the follicular cells to grow in size. Now, one other thing I want to talk to you about, here I have this written for you over here. The anterior pituitary releases FSH, and FSH is going to bind to a follicular cell, right, which is in brown. And just to let you know, I did not draw every single FSH receptor site. So here, everything in blue is an FSH receptor, everything in purple is an LH receptor, right? All of these follicle cells have FSH and LH receptors, right? Remember, a cell can have many receptor sites. So the FSH is going to bind onto the follicular cells, right? Specifically the FSH receptor of the follicular cell, right? Since FSH is a tropic hormone, that is going to cause, since FSH will bind onto the follicular cells, it's going to cause the follicular cells to release estrogen. And estrogen will bind onto the uterine lining, right? What's the purpose of estrogen binding onto the uterine lining? Well, it's going to help establish the uterine lining. It's going to make this uterine lining very thick. Because think about it, the whole purpose of this menstrual cycle is to prepare a woman to help her in case there is childbirth, right? In case there's pregnancy, right? Now, what are the functions of estrogen? Estrogen, as we all know, is the feminizing hormone, right? But it is also the estrogen establishes the uterine lining, right? Estrogen will bind onto the endometrial receptors of the uterus. So here's the endometrium again, right? So estrogen's going to bind on, and it's going to cause the thickening, the establishment of the uterine lining. Next up, on day 14, right at this period, we have what you call right before ovulation. Ovulation is the release of the egg into the abdominal cavity of a woman, which will eventually reach the fallopian tube, right? Here's ovulation for you right over here, number 4, right? If we go over here, right before ovulation, this is very important. This is a very high yield question. There is an LH surge. That LH surge is responsible for the ovulation. So right subtly around day 14, slightly before it, you have an LH surge, right? That, again, LH is produced by the anterior pituitary. And ovulation occurs. Now we have the word for, if you look at this ovarian follicle, once the egg leaves this ovarian follicle, it looks like this now. Notice there is no egg here. Notice we have this yellow body. It is actually really a yellow body. We still have the follicular cells, or the follicle cells. We have a name for that. We call that the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, right? Luteum means yellow. It's a yellow body. And what's happening here is now we're at day 14 through day 28. The anterior pituitary is going to release LH. LH is dominating that, right? LH, luteinizing hormone, is going to bind onto, again, a receptor site on the follicular cell, right? The LH receptor here is in purple. It is going to cause the follicular cells to secrete another hormone called progesterone. Right? Progesterone, if you look at the word progesterone, means to prepare for gestation. Right? It helps in gestation, fetal development. The progesterone will bind onto the uterus, and then the uterus becomes vascularized. So what do I mean by that? The uterus becomes very, very vascularized. In case vascular means blood vessels. The reason a woman has a lot of blood vessels in her uterus directly is because of progesterone, right? Well, why do you need a lot of blood vessels here? Notice in this diagram, we're looking at from day 14 through 28. Why do we need a lot of blood vessels there? Well, in case the egg, let's see, we're always thinking about evolution, right? In case an egg were to be, a fertilized egg were to implant, right? That's a sperm, the green part's the egg. Not only do we need a uterine lining, we have to nurture it with nutrients, right? How do we nurture it with nutrients? We put blood vessels in that region. How does that occur? Well, that's because of the progesterone that was released by those follicular cells, right? So here I wrote progesterone is the vascularizing hormone. It helps maintain that uterine lining. And progesterone is also responsible for increase in body temperature. Here is another diagram. Well, you know what? We'll talk about this in the next video because this